Women. Am I right, lads? Women, 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 women. Women in comics are like oil and water. They just don't go together. They're like Nickelback. They're not for everyone, but they have their place. Somewhere. That's right, I have out-of-date Nickelback jokes all the livelong day. In comics, a woman's place is to be the second for their male counterparts. Now, calm down, that's not all they're there for. They can also be typists, or babysitters, or models. If you felt like what I just said was reasonable, then like women in comics, there's a place for you too. And that place is the 1950s. Fortunately, we've come a long way since then, but progress doesn't tend to happen in a straight line. And history is rarely as simple as we like to think it is. See, women have been in comics for as long as comics have been a thing. And that is especially true of the superhero genre. So why are women still complaining about their place in comics? If they've been involved since the start, then surely we've completed equality, right? Well, no. I mean, obviously that's why I'm making this video. You can trace the first female superhero back to 1941 in the form of Miss Fury, who was created by this lady. Unfortunately, that character doesn't have the same staying power as the most famous female superhero of all time, which is of course Wonder Woman. And Diana is a great example as to why this conversation is so important. Wonder Woman was created by three people. William Marston, who wanted to make another superhero, his wife Elizabeth, who wanted that superhero to be a woman, and their domestic partner Olive Byrne, who was the inspiration for the character. And she certainly had an influence on Bill as well, who wrote this in 1943 about female readers.
Not even girls want to be girls so long as our feminine archetype lacks force, strength and power. Not wanting to be girls, they don't want to be tender, submissive, peace-loving as good women are. Women's strong qualities have become despised because of their weakness. The obvious remedy is to create a feminine character with all the strengths of Superman, plus all the allure of a good and beautiful woman.
I assume that's what he sounded like. And what he wrote sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Bear in mind, this is 1943. It's another 12 years before the first known lesbian rights organisation is formed. Homosexual relationships are still outlawed, and it was only 20 years prior that women got the right to vote. It was definitely a better time to be alive. Anyway, Wonder Woman burst onto the scene, and it wasn't long before she became President of the United States. Given America's track record recently, I'd say that was a win. From her very conception, Wonder Woman was a feminist character. Her bracelets were both a literal and psychological representation of the bondage imagery used by the suffrage movement. It not only represented restraint in the form of oppression by men, but also her own personal restraint to maintain peace and good judgment. In 1947, Marston would die, and his wife requested to continue to write for Wonder Woman. DC declined, of course, and instead hired writers such as Robert Kanigher. Unsurprisingly, this is where Wonder Woman's previous dominance took a turn for the worse. She was nerfed to the point of becoming the secretary for the Justice League. And to be fair, why would you want a character that's powerful and inspirational when they can instead just pick up the phone and take calls? But before anyone gets too angry with that revelation, that's not all Wonder Woman did. She was also a babysitter and a fashion model, so yay, feminism. Instead of her bondage representing oppression, Wonder Woman now craved bondage in the form of being a wife and a mother, like all women want. This trend continued well into the 1950s. Frederick Wortham published the book Seduction of the Innocent, where he claimed that juvenile delinquency was linked to reading comic books. It's like the modern day equivalent of linking violent video games with school shootings. And just like today, the reactionaries agreed. Their pressure forced the comic book industry to adopt a self-regulating code called the Comics Code Authority. This enabled publishers to continue creating stories and characters without having to jump through too many hoops. And they did this by eradicating certain themes such as sex and independent women to protect our children from satanic rituals like being a lesbian or a free-thinking woman. So female characters were relegated to becoming their male counterparts' side piece. Superman had Lois Lane, the Atom had Jean Loring, and the Green Lantern had Carol Ferris. Even if a female character was a crime fighter, her weapons of choice were stomach-churningly girly. Batwoman had powder puffs, charm bracelets, and perfume to fight crime, like all women have. And to be fair, it kind of makes sense. You want women to relate to these characters, so having them use common female products is just logical. just like the male characters using their shark repellent. I mean, personally, I never leave the house without mine. By the 70s, Marvel and DC were trying to one-up each other by introducing more and more female characters. Valkyrie, Storm, Spider-Woman and Huntress, just to name a few. As iconic as some of these characters grew to become, there were more interesting things happening in the underground scene. The Women's Liberation Basement Press produced a one-off comic called It Ain't Me Babe in 1970, which was the first comic created entirely by women. This would evolve into women's comics that would run until 1992, and it dealt with controversial women's issues. Other anthology series included Twisted Sister, as well as the greatest named anthology series of all time, Tits and Clits. With these titles and more, the underground scene was way ahead of the game, especially as it related to the female audience, which both Marvel and DC were fighting over. By the late 60s, Marvel decided to introduce a new character called Carol Danvers. She would later be known as Miss Marvel. Feel free to skip to the timecode on screen because this is going to get quite dark. By 1980, Marvel created one of its most misjudged and worst stories it's ever done. Miss Marvel was raped, gave birth to the child after the Avengers encouraged her to do so, and then rode off into the sunset with her rapist turned love interest. Chris Claremont, among many others, shared their disgust at this, and Marvel course corrected by having Miss Marvel shun the Avengers for being complicit in her assault. This is one of the primary reasons why this conversation is so important. We've gone from female characters becoming president to falling in love with their rapist. How that story got approved, I'll never know. But for every cloud, there is a silver lining, as many female superheroes got buffed by writers such as John Byrne. The Invisible Girl became the Invisible Woman, and she took charge of the Fantastic Four. Meanwhile, the Wasp took charge of the Avengers. But unlike in previous decades, there are more notable and long-lasting female superheroes appearing, and for my money, the best IP responsible for that is, ironically, the X-Men. Storm, Jean Grey, Rogue, Kitty Pryde, Psylocke, Polaris, Jubilee. I could continue, and I will. Mystique, X-23, Armor, Magic, the White Queen, the Scarlet Witch, Hope Summers, Betsy Braddock, Vertigo, Pixie, Siren, M, Wolfsbane, Dazzler, Magma, Husk. Claremont was credited as one of the pioneers for helping the transformation of these female characters, and the fandom referred to them as Claremont women. We were seeing females who were more like their male counterparts. They were strong and beautiful. So, problem solved, right? No, sorry lads, no, not quite. This may be cynical, but many women have accused certain comic creators of justifying sexy women by making them tough. It's like you can have a female character wear a thong and nipple tape as long as they're winning the fight. Now, that's a debate that can go on forever, but let's just say that that line of thinking is kind of missing the point. A character that, in my opinion, nailed that came from the shores of Blighty. Tank Girl broke through during the 90s, and instead of being strong and powerful, she was a punk with a shaved head. What she wore wasn't meant to accentuate her physical assets. They helped give her a cool personality. They even made a film which was fine. It was fine. I mean, it kind of killed the publication that originally published Tank Girl, but still, it was fine. It wasn't fine. Despite the apparent progression for women in comics, there were still glaring issues. Esteemed writer Gail Simone created the website Women in Refrigerators with the aim of documenting women in comics who had been either depowered or killed off, or both. She found that these plot devices disproportionately affected female characters over male characters. And that summarizes what has always been there, which is that for the majority of its history, women in comics were there to serve men in one way or another. Whether that is for their male counterpart as a love interest or for the targeted demographic, which were male teenagers and young adults. The body transformations of both male and females were not new. Since at least the 80s, the muscles of the men got bigger and the female body got pushed to breaking point with large breasts, tiny waists and big hips. Here are just a handful of examples. In both cases, these were fantasies for men. They wanted to look like Superman and be with Catwoman. Another way to help put this in perspective is to turn to films. Look at the difference between Suicide Squad and Birds of Prey. Same character, same actress, different director. Now, does that mean that comics cannot target men or men's desires? Absolutely not. Of course they can. But if you look across the superhero genre, which is the most visible, and you're seeing these women being held up, then you're distorting the audience. The audience has expanded beyond male teenagers and young adults. They're for everyone, and we should all be pushing towards that, not fighting against it. Fortunately, the trend of women being little but eye candy has seen a decline in recent years, with publishers hiring more women to draw and write. And yet, the debate about the depiction of women in comics still rages to this day. On the one hand, you have people who think that the sexualization of women shouldn't be looked down upon and it's totally legitimate. And on the other hand, you have people who are bored by this and feel that any sexual portrayal of a woman, especially by a man, is misogynistic. For me, I sit somewhere in the middle. It's not that I'm afraid of voicing an opinion, I just don't prescribe to a single-minded viewpoint when it comes to art. Sex in comics, as well as all art, is important, relevant, and something that will always attract an audience. It seems that sex is something that we all pretty much like. And that's fine. It shouldn't be looked down upon. Erotica and hentai are totally legit in principle, even if they do get a bit weird sometimes. These issues can seem complex and messy, especially as we're in the midst of another social revolution, particularly when it comes to gender roles. People feel confused, and confusion often lends itself to anger really quickly. Hopefully we can all agree that comics can be read and created by everyone. Not only can they, but they need to be. Because the more voices and interpretations we have of new and existing characters, the stronger the landscape of comics becomes as a whole. And if you're somehow scared by the changes that you see before you, then don't worry. I promise you there are plenty of comics that either star or feature sexy women. You don't have to look far. And if you're that passionate about women being portrayed in a certain way, then make your own comic. Honestly, the best way to react to art is to make art. If you're a woman watching this, then check out the comics in the description. I haven't read them all, but the ones that I have read, like Persepolis, are really good. Which isn't to say that only women should be reading them. And just so I'm crystal clear, I also think it's totally fine for men to write for women and women to write for men. But we need to be honest with our history and understand the impact that the representation of women as sex objects has on both our male and female audience. When that feels like it's everywhere, then we're going to turn women away from comics. And if you love comics, you shouldn't want that. It feels more and more like the question of women in comics is becoming less and less relevant. And that's a good thing. The more this feels normal, the better. The situation isn't perfect, but we have come a long way. And just as it happened to Wonder Woman in the 40s, comics have proven that it can go backwards and undo all the good work it's done. Suggesting that it can't is simply ignoring history. If anyone has any suggestions for comics with interesting female characters that nobody's heard of, let me know in the comments below. I'm compiling a list that I cannot afford, but I want to buy some more. And this is especially true if you've made your own comic, so drop the link below. Thanks for watching, consider subscribing, and I'll see you soon.